answer to the question is whether the two-state solution is still viable or not. I would say not clear. And what I'd like to do to explain to you how I see the situation is to borrow the analytical framework that we used in this textbook that Asher mentioned. This book essentially is a 13-chapter book for a 13-week semester, and all the chapters have the same structure. And I'll just focus on two aspects of all the chapters, which is it's the only book where you can, for every turning point in the history of the conflict, get side by side, read side by side, what was the Israeli interpretation or narrative about what happened, what was the Palestinian interpretation or narrative about what happened, and what were the broader Arab narratives about what happened. And the analytical section of the book, of all the chapters, is an effort to provide our students with a toolbox to understand developments in the history of the conflict. We focus, of course, on the past, but the idea is that they will be able to use the toolbox for the future. If they become an analyst in the CIA or DIA or the National Security Council, or in any other vocation that they will find themselves in. And the toolbox is very simple. It basically says if you want to understand anything in the history of the conflict, you have to be able to answer for yourselves, 4 questions. 1, what happened in the history, what happened in the international arena that can explain this development in the conflict? Second, what happened in the region, in the Middle East region, that can explain what happened in the conflict? What was the contribution, therefore, of the international system and the regional system to the development in the conflict? The third is, what happened in the domestic politics of the protagonists that can explain this development in the conflict? And the fourth question is, what's the role of individual leaders? How individual leaders have affected these developments? So what I'm going to do is use this toolbox to try to convey to you why the situation today is one of its worst in the history of the conflict, which makes it very difficult to provide a hopeful answer to this question of the ability to still resurrect the two-state solution. And the way I will do this is to compare the situation that we face today to a previous era. An era where Ed had black hair and I still had some. And the era is 1991, 1995. 4 years, 1991 to 1995, where in the Arab-Israeli conflict you saw 4 dramatic positive developments. In 1991, we had the Madrid conference, the first time that Israel and a large number of Arab states convened for the purpose of making peace in the region after the Gulf War. In 1992, a whole set of multilateral negotiations were launched between Israel, the Palestinian, and 13 Arab states to deal with economic development and refugees and the environment and regional security and arms control. Today, it looks like it belongs to a different era. The idea that for 2.5 years, Israelis and Arabs have sat in all these working groups trying to solve the region's problems. Then in 1993, we had the dramatic breakthrough of the Oslo Accords. And in 1994, we had the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. So these are 4 very, very dramatic positive developments that took place during this 4-year period. What made it possible for these dramatic developments to take place? As I said, what we're asking the students to do is to look at the global, the regional, the domestic politics, and the leadership to answer why things happen. So why have we had these 4 dramatic positive developments during this 4-year period? 1, at the global level, you had the end of the Cold War, the dismantlement of the Soviet Union. The United States remains the sole remaining superpower. It's a unipolar moment, and to some extent, to a large extent, it's the American moment. And you had, in addition to that, at the global level, a situation where the United States, because of these developments under President Bush 41 and Jim Baker, could talk about a new world order, and also which some translated to an American peace or a Pax Americana. That placed the United States in a unique situation, and with leaders that were ambitious to make the most out of this unique situation. What have we had at the regional level? We just had the Gulf War, the defeat of Iraq, the victory of a pro-American coalition or alliance that included Egypt and Saudi Arabia and even Syria, which shifts the balance of power in the region away from the radicals, the rejectionists like Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, in favor of the moderates or the relatively moderates in the Middle East. It produces the regional setting produced two additional trajectories that favored peace. One is that the PLO itself, and especially Arafat, were considerably weakened by the Gulf War, particularly by the perception that Arafat sided with Saddam Hussein, which angered the PLO's financial backers in the Gulf. And as a result of that, Arafat had to accept a compromise in Madrid that he had not accepted before, which is that the Palestinians would be represented there in the framework of a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. And that also explains why Arafat made the concessions that he made in Oslo. In Jordan, similarly, because King Hussein was perceived as having supported Saddam, understood that he could not restore the close relations with the U.S. if he didn't take, especially the attitude of the U.S. Congress to Jordan, if he did not take positive moves towards peace with Israel. So there is a whole set of developments at the regional level which all kind of conflated around the Gulf War and the after effects of the Gulf War, which allowed the United States to achieve and allowed the parties to achieve what they achieved with Madrid and the multilaterals and Oslo and the Jordanian peace treaty. What happened at the domestic politics level? I'll talk about Israel. Israel, during these years, this is the late 1980s, early 1990s, has a big mission, and the big mission is to absorb 1 million Jews, immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Because of that, it was also vulnerable to U.S. pressure to come to Madrid. And it was an administration led by Jim Baker who was able to exercise this leverage because Baker knew that Israel needed $10 billion of U.S. government loan guarantees to be able to absorb these 1 million Jews. Secondly, the Israeli domestic scene was affected by the first Palestinian Intifada of 1988 and 89. The result of this is that Israel actually underwent, during this period, a regime change, from essentially rejecting Likud and Shamir, and the resulting was the rise of labor led by Rabin. And on the Palestinian side, I won't focus on the Palestinian side of today, Khalil will do that, but during this period, as I said, we have a PLO that's weakened by the Gulf War, and Arafat and the PLO outsiders who were in Tunis feared losing influence to the insiders, those who were the face of the first Palestinian Intifada, Faisal Husseini, Hanan Ashrawi, Saeb Arikat, who became the face of the first Intifada and threatened the outside leadership in Tunis. So to regain control over the Palestinian agenda, Arafat needed to make these concessions, beginning with the representation in Madrid and then into Oslo. And then the fourth is leadership, individuals. We had Bush and Baker on the American side, and then Clinton that had the energy to try to create a new world order, and especially a new order in the Middle East. We had a prime minister in Israel, Rabin, who had the credibility after decades of service in the military forces, and being the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces during the '67 war, he had the legitimacy. He was called Mr. Security. He was trusted to make the concessions that needed to be made. And Arafat had the legitimacy as the founder, or the modern founder, of Palestinian nationalism, the George Washington in some respects of the Palestinians, who could also navigate the Palestinians to make these concessions. So if you look at the global, the regional, the domestic politics, and the individual levels, you could say all the stars were arrayed in the right direction. So the situation in 1991 and 1994 that explained these 4 positive breakthroughs, in one word, was good. And in 2 words, it was very good. Unfortunately, that's not the situation we find ourselves in right now, and especially in the last 2 years. At the global level, the American moment is over. The Obama administration's theme is basically to bring the boys home from Iraq, from Afghanistan. Nothing characterizes more Obama's approach to the Middle East, which he revealed in the interview to Jeff Goldberg in the Atlantic, which is, don't do stupid stuff. That's the mild version, by the way, of what I think he said. He's extremely skeptical of basing policy on premises and on theories, like the idea of reordering the Middle East by regime change and democratization, which of course characterized the Bush administration. He personally, Obama and the Obama administration, tried twice to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First in early 2009, after he nominated former Senator George Mitchell to lead these efforts, and then in 2013, when he gave the green light to John Kerry to try the best he can. This administration has been burnt twice. Both these efforts have failed. Will Obama try again during the last year or so that he has in office? I'm very, very skeptical, and that's an understatement. Will Obama's track record inspire the next president to try? Your guess is as good as mine. So the global star is definitely not in the right place. At the region, we're facing today an anarchic region, a chaotic region, a region in which at least 4 states, at least 2 of which were pillars of the Middle East when I entered this profession, or when I served in the Israeli military in the early 1970s. These 4 states no longer exist. Iraq no longer exists as we have known it. Syria no longer exists as we've known it. Libya no longer exists as we've known it. And Yemen no longer exists as we've known it. Lebanon has not been a unitary actor for decades, but today there are also certain areas of Egypt that are not completely governed. And then we've had a civil war in Syria that has taken a larger toll than the entire history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then there are other countries in the region that have weathered the storm better than others, especially the monarchies, and arguably Egypt as well. But they're all so self-absorbed right now in their own domestic issues, in their own domestic challenges, in all the effects of the Arab Spring on them. So the reality is that helping resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for these countries, is far from being a priority right now. So that's at the regional level. On the domestic level, I'll leave the Palestinian side to Khalil. I'll just give you a synopsis of my reading of the Israeli DNA at the moment. The Israeli domestic scene is dominated by the right. And by right, I mean those who are opposed to the concessions that need to be made for Palestinian statehood or for the conflict to be solved. Which, for me, by the way, that solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, for me, is important. It's important in the Palestinian context, but it's important for me first and foremost because there is no ability to secure Israel's character in the future as a Jewish and democratic state if we don't find a solution to the conflict with the Palestinians. Now, the point about this is that Israeli policy is dominated by the right, at least my reading of this is, not because the right has a majority, but because the right is mobilized, it's organized, and it's committed, while the left and the center left is at home. Why is it at home? Why is it not mobilized? It's at home, and why is it passive? It's at home because it lost faith in the process, and because it is paralyzed by fear. Why did it lose faith in the process? Because it became convinced, since the failure of the Camp David negotiations in 2000, and the very, very violent Second Intifada that followed that failure in 2001, 2004, all the way to its reading of the failed negotiations during the Olmert prime ministership, and all the way to the failed negotiations during the two efforts of the Obama administration. The center is convinced that the Palestinians are primarily at fault for the failure to achieve peace, or as is seen in Israel, that, quote, Israel does not have a Palestinian negotiation partner. And the reason why this narrative has become so paralyzing is because this narrative was not produced first, was not suggested first by Likud or by Netanyahu. It was first suggested by two labor leaders, Prime Minister Barak and the former Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben Ami, a person who's definitely to the left of center, as their reading of what explains the failure to reach an agreement at Camp David. So the fact that it's labor leaders that have coined this term, Israel does not have a negotiation partner, in my view, has paralyzed the center and the center left and allowed the right to dominate the agenda in Israel's case. Why the fear? Why do Israelis fear withdrawing from the West Bank to allow Palestinian statehood? They see Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon as having led to Katyusha rocket attacks from Lebanon and to the 2006 war. They see Israel's withdrawal from Gaza as having resulted in Qassam rocket attacks from Gaza and to 3 wars with Hamas. And they are stunned by the carnage taking place in the neighborhood, particularly in Syria, which is close by. And the problem is that without making a judgment as to whether they are fully justified, you can also admit that these fears are not totally baseless. They are based on certain realities. They are not the whole picture, but they are realities that inform enough to create this sense that this is a very, very, very dangerous environment, and the neighborhood has become very dangerous, and so the tendency is to hunker down and to say this is not the time to take risks. And of course, it makes them also, the public, very vulnerable to political leaders that are doing the most to manipulate these fears to serve their policy preferences. What do we have on the leadership level? Obama is not Bush 41, and he is not Bill Clinton. Abu Mazen is not Sadat, and he's not even Arafat. And Netanyahu is not Begin, and he's not even Rabin. So if all the stars were arrayed in the right direction in 1991 to 1995 and produced these 4 breakthroughs, from Madrid to Oslo and the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty, in my view, none of the stars is in its right location or correct location. It may be in the right location, but not the correct location today. So the result is the situation today, in 2 words, is not good. And in 5 words, it's really, really, really not good. And I'll give you the more positive twist in the Q&A. Thank you.